In a small, peaceful town where everyone knew each other by face, if not by name, life moved at its own gentle pace. It wasn't the kind of place where big news happened often, unless you counted Mrs. Harper's prize-winning roses or the annual bake sale that brought the whole community together. People here lived simple lives, content in their routines and familiar faces. Mrs. Harper, an 82-year-old widow with soft white hair and eyes full of warmth, was one of those familiar faces. She had lived on Maple Street for over 40 years, long enough to see kids grow into adults and trees stretch taller than houses. Her little house stood out because of her garden, a colourful patchwork of flowers, herbs, and vegetables. Every morning, she'd step outside, watering can in hand, humming old tunes while stray cats lounged nearby, hoping for scraps from her kitchen. That crisp autumn morning started like any other. The air smelled faintly of fallen leaves, and the sun peeked through thin clouds. Mrs. Harper walked slowly down the street after finishing her weekly grocery run. A reusable bag hung heavily from her arm, filled with bread, milk, apples, and a few treats she liked to enjoy with her afternoon tea. She nodded politely at neighbours as they passed by, exchanging pleasantries about the weather or how beautiful her marigolds looked this year. But what seemed like just another ordinary day was about to take a turn no one could have predicted. Unbeknownst to Mrs. Harper, 2 rookie police officers were patrolling the area. They were young, inexperienced, and jittery after receiving reports of vandalism in the neighbourhood earlier that week. Their instructions were clear. Stay alert. Keep an eye out for anything unusual. But unusual meant different things to different people. And to these officers, Mrs. Harper's slow shuffle and the way she paused occasionally to catch her breath didn't look quite right. As they watched her from their patrol car, suspicion began to creep in. Why was she moving so slowly? Was she hiding something? Without thinking it through, they decided to approach her, not kindly, not gently, but with flashing lights and hurried footsteps. Little did they know, their hasty decision would set off a chain of events that would leave the entire town talking for weeks to come. And little did Mrs. Harper know, her quiet walk home was about to become anything but ordinary. The 2 officers stepped out of their patrol car, their boots crunching against the gravel as they approached Mrs. Harper. She barely noticed them at first, too focused on keeping her balance while holding the heavy grocery bag. But when one of them called out, "Ma'am, stop right there," her head snapped up in surprise. Her heart skipped a beat. Stop? What for? She hadn't done anything wrong. Confused, she turned to face them, squinting slightly in the bright sunlight. "Is something the matter?" she asked, her voice trembling, just a little. The weight of the bag pulled at her arm, and she shifted it awkwardly, trying to ease the strain. Instead of answering her question, one officer took a step closer, his hand resting on the baton at his side. His tone was sharp, almost accusatory. "Where are you coming from? What's in the bag?" Mrs. Harper blinked, taken aback by the sudden interrogation. "I'm just coming back from the store," she said softly, holding up the bag so they could see inside. Bread, apples, a carton of milk. It was all perfectly ordinary. But the officers didn't seem satisfied. They exchanged glances, their expressions hardening. One of them reached out abruptly, grabbing her wrist. "Don't move," he barked. Startled, Mrs. Harper flinched and tried to pull away, but her frail body offered no resistance. The movement caused the bag to slip from her grasp, sending groceries tumbling onto the sidewalk. Apples rolled across the pavement, and the bread landed in a crumpled heap near the curb. "Why are you treating me like this?" Mrs. Harper cried, tears welling up in her eyes. Her voice cracked with fear and confusion. "I haven't done anything." But the officers weren't listening anymore. Their nerves were frayed, their training overshadowed by panic. To them, her attempts to explain herself looked like resistance. One of them shoved her roughly, and she stumbled backward, landing hard on the ground. The impact knocked the wind out of her, leaving her gasping for air. As she lay there, dazed and hurting, the unthinkable happened. One of the officers raised his baton, striking her frail leg. Pain shot through her body, and and she let out a cry that echoed down the quiet street. The other officer joined in, shouting accusations that made no sense. Something about vandalism, something about resisting arrest. None of it added up, but none of it mattered anymore. Neighbors who had been watching from their windows or passing by on foot froze in shock. Some covered their mouths, unable to believe what they were seeing. Others whispered urgently to each other, unsure of what to do. No one dared to intervene, not yet. Fear held them back, even as anger bubbled beneath the surface. For Mrs. Harper, time seemed to slow down. Each blow felt heavier than the last, not just because of the physical pain, but because of the sheer disbelief. How could this be happening? She was just an old woman trying to get home. What had she done to deserve this? And then, just as suddenly as it began, the chaos stopped. For a moment, at least. A loud voice cut through the tension, deep and commanding, like thunder rolling across the sky. Heads turned, including those of the officers, whose faces went pale as they realized someone had witnessed everything. Someone who wasn't going to stand by and let this continue. The voice that cut through, the air was unmistakable, deep, powerful, and full of authority. It belonged to a man who didn't need introductions. Even before anyone saw him, they knew exactly who it was. Mike Tyson had arrived, and his presence alone was enough to make the officers freeze mid-action. Tyson hadn't planned to be there that day. He was in town for a charity event, driving through the neighborhood when something caught his eye, a commotion up ahead. At first glance, it looked like a routine police stop, but as he got closer, the scene became clearer. An old woman lay on the ground, surrounded by spilled groceries, while two officers towered over her, their batons raised menacingly. The sight made his stomach churn with anger. Without hesitation, Tyson slammed on the brakes of his SUV, opened the door, and stepped out onto the street. His towering frame commanded attention immediately. People turned to look, their eyes wide with disbelief. Was that really the Mike Tyson? Yes, it was, and he meant business. What the hell is going on here? Tyson bellowed, his voice cutting through the tension like a knife. Every head snapped toward him, including those of the officers, who suddenly looked smaller than ever under his glare. One of them stammered, trying to explain themselves, but their words came out jumbled and weak. They pointed at Mrs. Harper, lying on the ground, accusing her of resisting arrest, though she hadn't moved an inch since being struck down. Tyson ignored their excuses and rushed to Mrs. Harper's side. Kneeling beside her, he gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his tone softening instantly. Gone was the booming voice. Now, it was replaced by genuine concern. Mrs. Harper, still dazed and trembling from pain, managed a weak nod. Her breathing was shallow, and tears streamed down her cheeks. But she clung to his arm as if it were a lifeline. Turning back to the officers, Tyson's expression hardened again. His jaw tightened, and his piercing gaze locked onto them. "You call this justice?" he growled, pointing at Mrs. Harper. "Beating up an old lady? What kind of monsters are you?" The officers fidgeted nervously, glancing at each other for support that wasn't coming. One of them reached for his radio, likely planning to call for backup, but Tyson wasn't about to let them off that easily. "Don't bother," he said, sharply. "I've already recorded everything on my phone." And he wasn't bluffing. From the moment he'd stepped out of his car, Tyson had discreetly started filming the incident, capturing every brutal detail. By now, the crowd that had gathered was buzzing with murmurs. Some people began pulling out their phones too, recording the confrontation. Word spread quickly, and soon, neighbors who hadn't been outside earlier came rushing to see what was happening. A few even shouted angry comments at the officers, demanding answers and accountability. The atmosphere shifted. The balance of power had changed, and the officers could feel it. For Mrs. Harper, the world around her felt surreal. Pain radiated through her body, but she couldn't tear her eyes away from the man kneeling beside her. She recognized him instantly, the legendary boxer whose name everyone knew, but seeing him in person, defending her like this, felt like something out of a dream. Or maybe a nightmare, given the circumstances. Either way, she was grateful. As Tyson stood up, positioning himself between Mrs. Harper and the officers, the tension in the air was electric. This wasn't just about stopping an injustice anymore. It was personal. For Tyson, it was a chance to stand up for someone who couldn't defend herself. For the officers, it was a moment of reckoning, one they weren't prepared for. And for the crowd, it was a reminder that heroes can appear when you least expect them. The officers stood there, frozen like deer caught in headlights. Mike Tyson's towering figure loomed over them, his presence impossible to ignore. One of them tried to speak, their voice shaky and unsure. "Sir, you don't understand. She resisted arrest," they blurted out, pointing at Mrs. Harper as if that would somehow justify what had just happened. Tyson didn't flinch. His eyes narrowed, sharp and unyielding. "Resisted arrest," he shot back, his deep voice dripping with disbelief. "She's an old woman lying on the ground in pain, and you're telling me she resisted arrest? Do you even hear yourself? Right now!" The crowd around them began to grow louder, murmurs turning into shouts of disapproval. Neighbors who had been hesitant to step in earlier now felt emboldened by Tyson's arrival. Someone yelled, "Shame on you!" while another called out, "Leave her alone!" The officers glanced nervously at the growing number of people surrounding them, realizing they were losing control of the situation. One of the officers took a step back, trying to distance himself from Tyson's piercing gaze. He fumbled for his radio again, muttering something about calling for backup. But Tyson wasn't having it. In one swift motion, he raised his hand, signaling for them to stop. "I said, don't bother," he repeated firmly, his tone leaving no room for argument. "This ends here." For a moment, no one moved. The tension hung heavy in the air, thick enough to cut with a knife. The officers looked at each other, silently debating their next move. They knew they were outnumbered, not just physically, but morally. Everyone watching could see the truth. This was wrong. And Tyson, standing tall and unshakable, wasn't going to let them squirm their way out of it. Mrs. Harper, still seated on the ground, clutched her side as she watched the standoff unfold. She felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, relief, awe. Fear because she was still vulnerable, relief because someone had finally stepped in to protect her, and awe because that someone was none other than Mike Tyson. She never imagined she'd meet him, let alone have him defend her so fiercely. Tyson turned slightly, glancing down at her with concern. "You okay, Mom?" he asked again, his voice softer this time. She nodded weakly, though tears continued to roll down her cheeks. He gave her a reassuring nod before turning his attention back to the officers. "You hurt her," he said, his words deliberate and heavy. "And I'm not letting you walk away from this." The officers exchanged another uneasy glance, their confidence crumbling under the weight of Tyson's glare and the crowd's growing anger. One of them muttered something about following protocol, but it sounded hollow even to their own ears. They knew they were in trouble, and deep down, they probably knew they deserved it. As the confrontation dragged on, Tyson made sure to keep himself between Mrs. Harper and the officers. Every time one of them shifted or reached for their equipment, he stepped closer, his body language clear. "Try something, and you'll regret it." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise, and everyone present could feel it. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, one of the officers lowered his baton and took another step back. We'll wait for our supervisor," he mumbled, avoiding eye contact with both Tyson and the crowd. His partner followed suit, though neither of them looked comfortable. They stood there awkwardly, their earlier bravado completely gone. The crowd erupted into cheers and applause, some people clapping Tyson on the back as he remained firmly rooted in place. For Mrs. Harper, the sound of support was overwhelming, but in a good way. After feeling so powerless moments ago, she now realized she wasn't alone. Not anymore. With Tyson standing guard and an entire neighborhood rallying behind her, she finally felt safe. But this wasn't over yet. Tyson knew that. As the officers waited silently for reinforcements, he knelt beside Mrs. Harper once more, whispering softly, "Don't worry, Ma'am. We're going to make sure this gets fixed." His words carried a quiet determination, one that promised justice wasn't far behind. As the crowd's cheers filled the air, the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. The two officers stood there, defeated and humiliated, their earlier aggression replaced by a mix of fear and regret. They knew they were in deep trouble, not just because of Mike Tyson's intervention, but because the entire neighborhood, and likely the world, was about to find out exactly what they'd done. Tyson didn't waste any time. He stayed close to Mrs. Harper, making sure she was comfortable while keeping a watchful eye on the officers. "Stay here with me," he told her gently, his voice steady and reassuring. "Help is coming." She nodded weakly, still clutching her side, though the pain seemed slightly dulled now that she wasn't alone anymore. Within minutes, the sound of sirens pierced the air. Backup had arrived. Not just more police cars, but an ambulance too. Paramedics rushed over to Mrs. Harper, checking her injuries and carefully helping her onto a stretcher. Tyson stayed by her side the entire time, refusing to leave until he was certain she was in good hands. "You're going to be okay," he told her firmly, squeezing her hand before stepping back to let the medics do their job. Meanwhile, the arrival of higher-ranking officers changed the dynamic completely. These weren't rookies. They were seasoned professionals who could immediately sense something was very wrong. When they saw the scene, the spilled groceries, the distraught old woman being loaded into an ambulance, and the angry crowd pointing fingers at the two officers, they wasted no time taking control of the situation. One of the senior officers approached Tyson, extending a hand. "Sir, thank you for stepping in," he said sincerely. "We'll handle this from here." Tyson shook the man's hand, but didn't soften his expression. "Good," he replied, his tone firm. "Because this isn't just about today. This is about fixing a bigger problem." Word of the incident spread like wildfire. Someone in the crowd had already posted the video online, capturing every moment of Tyson confronting the officers and defending Mrs. Harper. By the time the sun set that evening, the story had gone viral. News outlets picked it up. Social media exploded with reactions, and hashtags like "Huck's Justice for Her" and "Huck's Real Life Hero" began trending worldwide. People couldn't stop talking about it. How often did you see a retired boxing legend step in to protect someone like that? For many, Tyson's actions were a wake-up call, a reminder that standing up against injustice matters, no matter who you are or where you come from. And for Mrs. Harper, the attention brought both relief and discomfort. She never imagined her quiet life would become the center of national headlines. But she also knew it meant one thing: people cared. The next day, investigators launched a formal inquiry into the officer's conduct. Evidence mounted quickly: the video footage Tyson recorded, witness statements from neighbors, and even medical reports detailing Mrs. Harper's injuries. It became clear that the officers had acted recklessly, letting their nerves and poor judgment spiral into violence. Within days, they were suspended without pay, pending further investigation and potential criminal charges. But Tyson wasn't satisfied with just holding the officers accountable. He wanted to make sure something like this wouldn't happen again. During interviews with reporters, he spoke passionately about the need for better training and oversight within law enforcement. "It's not enough to punish bad cops," he said during one press conference. "We need to fix the system so good cops can do their jobs without fear of making mistakes like this." Mrs. Harper, recovering slowly in the hospital, watched these developments unfold from her bed. Though her body ached, her spirit felt lighter. Knowing that her suffering might lead to change gave her a sense of purpose she hadn't felt in years. And knowing that someone like Mike Tyson had stood up for her made her believe once again in the goodness of people. For Tyson, the experience reignited a fire inside him. He realized how much influence he still had, not as a boxer, but as a voice for those who couldn't speak for themselves. As he visited Mrs. Harper in the hospital days later, bringing flowers and a warm smile, he promised her one thing: "This is just the beginning." The days following the incident felt like a whirlwind for everyone involved. For Mrs. Harper, life had shifted in ways she never expected. After being discharged from the hospital, she returned to her quiet home on Maple Street, but things weren't quite the same. Reporters camped outside her house, eager to hear her story. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and flowers, offering words of support and admiration. Even strangers sent letters and care packages, touched by her resilience and the courage she showed in speaking out about what happened. But it wasn't just sympathy that poured in. It was action. Inspired by Mike Tyson's bold stand, people began rallying around the cause of police accountability. Local community groups organized meetings to discuss how they could push for reforms. Some started petitions demanding better training for officers, while others planned peaceful protests to keep the conversation alive. It was as if the entire town had woken up, realizing that change was possible if enough people cared enough to try. Tyson himself became a driving force behind these efforts. He didn't just speak at press conferences or give interviews. He rolled up his sleeves and got to work. Within weeks, he announced the launch of a new foundation aimed at supporting victims of police misconduct. The organization would provide legal assistance, counseling, and financial aid to those who needed it most. More than that, it would focus on building trust between communities and law enforcement through education and dialogue. Mrs. Harper played a key role in this initiative, despite her initial hesitation. "I'm just an old woman," she'd said, when Tyson first asked her to join him at a public event. But he shook his head firmly. "No, ma'am, you're a symbol of strength. People need to see you, hear your voice, and know they're not alone." Reluctantly, she agreed, and soon found herself standing beside Tyson at rallies and fundraisers, sharing her story with anyone who would listen. Her soft-spoken words carried weight, reminding everyone of the human cost of unchecked power. As the weeks turned into months, the impact of their partnership grew. The two officers involved in the incident were eventually convicted of excessive force and sentenced to prison terms. While some argued the punishment wasn't harsh enough, others saw it as a step toward accountability, a message that no one, not even those in uniform, was above the law. In the town itself, changes began taking shape. The local police department implemented mandatory de-escalation training for all its officers. Community outreach programs sprang up, encouraging residents to engage with law enforcement in positive ways. Slowly but surely, the tension that had once simmered beneath the surface started to ease. For Mrs. Harper, the transformation was profound. Though her body still bore the scars of that fateful day, her spirit had healed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She often sat in her garden, watching the birds flit between trees, and reflected on how far she'd come. "I thought I was invisible," she admitted during one interview. "But now I know, I matter. We all do." And then there was Tyson. For him, this experience wasn't just about justice for Mrs. Harper. It was about rediscovering his purpose. Long after the headlines faded and the world moved on, he continued fighting for those without a voice. Whether it was visiting schools to talk about respect and responsibility, or meeting with lawmakers to advocate for policy changes, he remained committed to making a difference. Together, Mrs. Harper and Tyson proved that even in the darkest moments, light can break through. Their bond, a chance encounter turned lifelong friendship, became a beacon of hope for countless others. And though neither of them sought fame or recognition, they earned something far more valuable: the gratitude of a community that finally believed in the possibility of change. Months had passed since that unforgettable day on Maple Street, but its ripple effects were still being felt. The town had transformed in subtle yet meaningful ways. People greeted each other more warmly, neighbors checked in on one another, and the once stifling fear of authority began to lift. It wasn't perfect. Change never came overnight. But the seeds of trust had been planted, and they were starting to grow. For Mrs. Harper, life had taken on a new rhythm. She was no longer just the sweet old woman with the beautiful garden. She was now a symbol of resilience and courage. Though she humbly insisted she hadn't done anything extraordinary, her willingness to share her story inspired countless others to speak up about their own experiences with injustice. Her quiet strength reminded everyone that even the smallest voices could spark big changes. One sunny afternoon, the town gathered for a special ceremony outside the local courthouse. A plaque had been unveiled to honor both Mrs. Harper and Mike Tyson, a tribute not only to their bravery, but also to the lessons learned from that painful chapter. The inscription read, "In memory of courage and compassion, a testament to standing up for what's right." As Mrs. Harper stood beside Tyson, smiling shyly at the crowd, it was clear how much this moment meant to her. Tears glistened in her eyes as applause erupted, echoing through the streets she'd called home for decades. Tyson, ever humble, stepped forward to say a few words. "This isn't about me," he began, his deep voice steady and sincere. "It's about all of us, about remembering that we're stronger together. If I can leave you with one thing today, let it be this. Don't look away when you see something wrong. Speak up, step in. Be the person someone needs when they need it most." His words resonated deeply, earning cheers and nods of agreement from the crowd. After the ceremony, people lingered, chatting and laughing under the bright blue sky. Mrs. Harper found herself surrounded by well-wishers, many of whom shared stories of how her courage had touched their lives. One young boy handed her a drawing of her garden, complete with colourful flowers and a tiny figure labelled "Hero." She chuckled softly, patting his head. "Thank you, sweetheart," she said, her voice filled with warmth. "But heroes come in all shapes and sizes. You'll see that someday." As for Tyson, he continued travelling across the country, using his platform to shine a light on issues that mattered. He visited schools, spoke at conferences, and worked tirelessly with his foundation to support victims of police misconduct. But he never forgot where it all began. That quiet little town and the remarkable woman who had unknowingly changed the course of his life. Whenever he returned, he made sure to stop by Mrs. Harper's house, often bringing groceries or helping her tend to her beloved garden. Their unlikely friendship became a source of joy and inspiration for them both. Years later, when people talked about what happened that autumn morning, they didn't just focus on the violence or the outrage. It was the humanity that stayed with them, the way an entire neighborhood rallied around one of its own, the way a retired boxing champion stepped in without hesitation, and the way an elderly woman refused to let bitterness take root in her heart, choosing instead to forgive and move forward. Mrs. Harper's garden flourished as if fed by hope itself, attracting bees, butterflies, and visitors eager to catch a glimpse of the woman behind the story. For her, every bloom was a reminder that even after the darkest storms, beauty could emerge. And for Tyson, every handshake, every hug, every thank you note reinforced why he'd chosen to step in that day, not because he wanted recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. In the end, their journey proved something powerful. Heroes aren't born, they're made. Sometimes all it takes is one act of kindness, one moment of bravery, to remind us of our shared humanity. And in that small town, where life moved at its own gentle pace, two very different people showed the world what true heroism looked like. Not with capes or superpowers, but with compassion, courage, and an unshakable belief in doing what's right.